What's up guys, this is Nathan and I'm Reviewer Guy, and I'm here with another episode of my series, Review Roundup. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this series, it features me giving my thoughts on albums that came out during the last 3 months that I wasn't able to make their own full-fledged review videos for. I'll be doing these in order of release date. So with all that out of the way, let's get on with this past quarter's Review Roundup. Machine Gun Kelly is one of those rappers that, while I've never fully gotten into his music, I enjoy a few songs and I do see his talent and appeal. He has some songs that have a lot of emotion and others that have a lot of energy, and I think he's one of the more versatile rappers in the game today since he's willing to try new things and not stick with the same formula. That doesn't mean he doesn't have any songs that fall under that typical rap formula, because that's not the case. There are songs on this disc like Floor 13, which sounds like a typical diss track slash hyping themselves up song, and Candy, which uses the word candy as a euphemism for drugs. A rap song about drugs, what a shock, right? I also don't like the interludes on this album. They're stupid and they don't offer anything to the album. They even said at the end of a message from the Count, "That's not funny," and I fully agree with that. Those two interludes could have easily been left off the album, and I honestly think that would have improved it a little bit. There are also some positives on this album. Many of the verses have solid flow, and there are a good amount of catchy beats on the album as well. As for songs, Hollywood Whore is catchy and has a nice groove to it. Glass House sounds meaningful, and I like Naomi Wild's parts on that track. And of course, the brilliant closer, I Think I'm Okay. This is a loud, energetic, and I might even say anthemic pop, punk slash rap rock song. Travis Barker's drumming really adds to the vibe, and Youngblood's vocals complement MGK's wonderfully. Overall, I give Hotel Diablo a 6 out of 10. I feel like there are moments on this album that are just okay, then there are actual bad ones. I've never been much of a Creed fan, but I always thought Scott Stapp had potential. He just needed to get out of his own head. Some of his solo stuff that he did prior to this album was okay, as was some of his work with Art of Anarchy. The potential is there, and it shows on this album in places. World I Used to Know is an engaging enough opening track, Purpose for Pain has some neat backing vocals and a solid chorus, and Red Clouds has a good amount of build up to it and fills out its 5-minute length fairly well. However, there are some songs on this disc that don't show Scott reaching his full potential. Actually, there are quite a few. Songs like Heaven and Me and Ready to Love sound like whiny, melodramatic preachings to me, and songs like Wake Up Call and Gone Too Soon are just so boring and have no substance to them. And I'm not going to go too much into detail on the lyrics and name, but it shows Scott's hypocritical side. Also, it's just a boring song in general. The quality of tracks on the album is pretty inconsistent. There is some decent work, but it's bogged down with a lot of generic, boring, and meaninglessly preachy nonsense. Overall, I give The Space Between the Shadows a 5 out of 10. I hope you all appreciate my sacrifice of listening to this album, but if you're a Scott Stapp fan, I apologize for not being able to make the score higher. Northlane is a name I've heard thrown around a little bit over the years, so I figured I'd check out their new album. Through my research, I discovered that between this album and their previous release, they've been stepping away from the traditional metalcore format, and are going into more of an industrial direction, and I really don't have any problems with that. Since I'm not all too familiar with their earlier material, I can't compare their old and new sound. Marcus Bridge is a solid vocalist in both the clean and unclean department. There's a nice contrast between the melodic parts and heavier parts of the album, on both the vocal and instrumental sides of it. I mentioned that the band are going in more of an industrial direction with their sound, and that is apparent here, but it's not overpowering. To me, this still sounds like a metalcore album through and through. You have the melodic singing, the harsh screams, the pounding drums, the chugging guitars, and your standard breakdowns. Just throw some filters on everything in certain spots and add some effects here and there, and that's the sound we're talking about with this album. But just so you're all clear, I'm a fan of a lot of those things, and I think they're done well on this release. Another thing I like is the flow on the album, especially on the second half. It feels like each track transitions to the next flawlessly in the second half of the album. This disc doesn't do anything to reinvent the wheel, and not everything on here is a clear winner, but I'm liking this album for the most part. Overall, I give Alien a 7 out of 10. This may not be the most memorable metalcore album I've heard this year, but I still think it's some good work. I will not take anything away from the band here. Here we are with the new Skillet album. I was debating for a while whether or not I even wanted to tackle this album because while I still enjoy some of their music, Skillet are one of those bands that I feel just do less and less for me as time passes. But I figured I'd give their new album a shot anyway. Not saying I'll pay a lot of attention to them moving forward though. For the most part, I found this album very boring and the music feels like it tries too hard. I know Skillet are a Christian band and their whole thing is to make inspirational music, and I think that's great. But I feel like they've run out of ways to do that, and they just feel like they're repeating themselves. Most of this stuff isn't all that engaging and could be forgotten easily. The vocals and instrumentals all sound fine, but they feel empty to me. There are some nice riffs and vocal harmonies on this album, and those are the types of things I'm a little bit of a sucker for, so I'll give them a couple points for that. There are a couple tracks that I would call favorites on the album, like Save Me and Anchor, despite both of them being really cheesy. Other than that though, there's not a whole lot going on here that's worthwhile. Overall, I give Victorious a 4 out of 10. It's always a shame when you find yourself falling out of love with a band, but life goes on. Who knows, maybe I'll turn back around on Skillet. Only time will tell. We'll be talking about a few electronic albums on this episode. The first of these is Ascend from Chicago act Eleni. Random side note, and this is probably just my nerdy side showing, but I can't see or hear the name Eleni without thinking of Ingenium from My Hero Academia. I've never heard of him before, but I first heard his song Good Things Fall Apart featuring John Bellion, which is from this album, and I love that song, so I figured I'd give the whole album a shot, and, well, to be honest, I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. This album feels bloated with a lot of fluff. A lot of these songs blend together and they're basically interchangeable. There are some good tracks on here, like the aforementioned Good Things Fall Apart and Lonely, but there are also songs that I either can't stand, like Blood, or songs that start off alright but get really bad, like Gorgeous. There are also songs like All Together and Every Piece of Me that have parts that sound promising, but the overall end result just comes out being average. There are a lot of guests on this release, but I can't tell a lot of them apart to be honest, so I'm not even going to try to differentiate them. There are some nice beats throughout this album, but I find that others can get monotonous. There are also some really nice and even beautiful vocals on here, but the distortion and filtering ruins that in some places. I get that that's pretty much a staple in electronic music, but I feel like there has to be some kind of balance. Overall, I give Ascend a 5 out of 10. As a whole, this album's a mixed bag with some good songs, but I'm not sure how much of a shelf life they'll have, and a lot of either bad songs or forgettable ones. You never know where ideas for what albums to cover are going to come from. About 3 years ago, my nephew suggested that I review a Lindsey Stirling album on my channel. It's a little late, but I figured since I'm trying to explore more genres, especially when it comes to electronic music, why not? I've heard a few Lindsey Stirling songs prior to this release, and I've thought the music was just okay. The concept is pretty cool, as she plays the violin alongside electronic music. I think that's very unique, and it makes for some interesting possibilities. This is mostly an instrumental album, but there are a few tracks that contain vocals. There are a couple of guest vocalists on this album, such as Amy Lee on Love Goes On, and Ellie King on the Upside, which has both an instrumental version and a version with guest vocals on the album. I love Amy Lee's voice, and I don't even need to tell you guys how talented she is. If you've ever listened to Evanescence, you can figure that out for yourself. The track she's featured on is one of the best on the album. As for Ellie King, well, to be honest, I'm not really a fan of her voice, nor do the lyrics add anything to the song for me, so I much prefer the instrumental version of the Upside. There's a bit of blend and overlap throughout the album. Some of the songs just run together. This is a nice album to put on in the background. It has its energetic moments as well as its more calm and serene ones. The tracks that have backing vocals, like the title track and Between Twilight, help with the latter vibe. But just because I think it's a good background album doesn't mean I think it's bad. On the contrary, I think this disc is pretty solid. Overall, I give Artemis a 7 out of 10. There is some really beautiful music on here. If you're a fan of violin music, electronic music, or of course Lindsey Stirling in general, I recommend this album. Does anyone even remember the band Cold? They had some big songs in the 2000s like Just Got Wicked, No One, and probably their biggest hit, Stupid Girl. Well, this is their first album in 8 years, and I'll be honest, I like a few songs from these guys. I think they're a very capable band, and they've had numerous lineup changes over the years, but the music hasn't changed drastically. To be honest, the only thing that's changed about their music over the years is the fact that it's become very mundane and boring. As a matter of fact, I think this album is too drawn out. It feels so slow and dull, and in some cases like one 45-minute long song, but that might be taking it a little too far. Scooter Ward has some solid vocal moments on this record, and I've personally always thought his voice was the best thing about the band. There's not a lot of differentiation between the 12 songs on this album though. They just go from bland but passable to bland and forgettable. Plus the mixing is so weird on this album. Scooter sounds far too loud on some of these tracks. There's nothing outright bad on here, but the band just sounds as bored making this thing as I was listening to it. Overall, I give The Things We Can't Stop a 5 out of 10. It's not a terrible release, but if you were waiting 8 years for it, I'd definitely call it a disappointment. Oh boy, here we go. You know, it would be really easy for me to tear the new Puddle of Mud album to shreds, but where's the class? Where's the sophistication in that? After all, Wes Scantlin is one of the greatest songwriters of the early 2000s post-grunge nu metal scene. The man gave us such great lyrics on this album as "Uh-oh, I fucked it up again, I did a real good job," and "I know you want to make it to heaven in the sky, don't worry baby, cause God'll save your life." Alright, enough of that stupid bit. I'm sure you guys know what to expect from Puddle of Mud at this point. Wes Scantlin is allegedly in a better place now, and I really hope that's true, but the music on this album is really nothing to write home about. In most places, it's downright awful, but I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. The lyrics are terrible, the instrumentals are bland and forgettable, and Wes's voice sounds the same as it always has. Now I'll admit, I actually think You Don't Know starts off the album well. It has a solid intro, and lyrically it's probably the most passable you'll get on this album. And I'll be damned if Uh-oh isn't a catchy tune. It's generic, but it has a really catchy hook, and I can't help but really like this song, even if it is ironically. The explicit version, that is. The album ends with another version of the song called the Come Clean version, an obvious throwback to their breakthrough album. It's pretty much the same song, just a clean version that also adds some additional vocal parts, which I think is completely unnecessary. As for positives, that's about all I've got. Just about every other song on the album is either bland, annoying, or just plain bad. Overall, I give Welcome to Galvania a 3 out of 10. Well, we have another Puddle of Mud album in the books. Let's wait and see if we get another one, and another Mudfest too. That's just what the world needs, right? If you were watching this channel in 2016, you would know that the last time I talked about M83, I was not too keen on their album Junk. However, I feel like I need to revisit that album because my tastes have definitely changed since then, and I've come to appreciate more of M83's work. One of those albums being the 2007 release Digital Shades Volume 1. Which has a very atmospheric and ambient sound to it. It even dips a little into drone music territory. It's a nice calming listen for sure, and that's why I wanted to check out DSV2, which is a sequel to that album. Anthony Gonzalez said this album was inspired by playing video games from the 80s, saying the older games were naive and touching, as well as simple and imperfect. Inspiration also came from sci-fi and fantasy movie soundtracks of that decade, as well as synthesizer music of that period. I can definitely hear those influences on here. I describe this album as an ambient synthwave and maybe even chillwave project. It's a bit different than Volume 1 because that focused more on a drone sound. Although that album, while keeping them to a minimum, did contain lyrics. DSV2 does not contain any lyrics, just a few rather soothing vocals. I enjoyed the atmosphere on this release, and I think it's a slight improvement from Volume 1, which I also thoroughly enjoyed. This music sounds like it could fit right in on the soundtrack of either an old video game or a modern game that's more of a throwback to that old style. I'm sorry I'm not describing the actual sound of the music well here, but I feel like this is something you really need to seek out yourself to fully understand it. Overall, I give DSV2 a 7.5 out of 10. This is another good chill-out type of album. I might listen to it the next time I play Cosmic Star Heroine. I figured I'd conclude today's episode by talking about a country album for the first time. I'm not a fan of most country music, especially most modern country music, but Zac Brown Band is an exception to that. But there are sometimes exceptions to those exceptions, and The Owl falls under that category. Where do I even begin with this album? Well, one of the things I like about Zac Brown Band is that they're the antithesis of the usual modern country formula. They usually stay away from that bro country style, but on this album, they embrace it. It sounds like they took pages right out of Florida Georgia Line and Luke Bryan's playbooks. The worst part about that is the fact that Zac Brown has notably criticized the bro country genre, and the band still pulled this stunt. But believe it or not, that's not even the worst thing about this album for me. That lies in its inconsistency. This record has absolutely no idea what it wants to be. It mixes in pop and EDM elements into their usual guitar and fiddle music, and there are also some slower and more country and maybe even a little bit of folk-leaning tracks, and it doesn't sound good. They mixed a bunch of different styles on their 2015 album Jekyll and Hyde, and it actually worked there. I don't know what happened here. From the grating, snappy, poppy OMW, to the god-awful distorted voice on Already on Fire, to the terribly boring Finish What We Started that even a guest appearance from Brandi Carlile can't improve, it's just awful. It is all awful. I will say there is at least a little bit of competence being shown on this disc, both vocally and instrumentally. There are probably a couple short 3 to 5 second clips that I can stand, but listening to this album gave me a headache. And there's only one other album that I've heard this year that did that. Overall, I give The Owl a 1.5 out of 10. I really hope this was just a fluke for Zac Brown Band, because otherwise, there really is no hope for the state of modern country music. Thank you guys for watching this review roundup. I try to do these roughly every 3 months, but I do full-fledged album reviews more frequently, of course. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think about any of these albums. You can follow me on my social media links in the description, and check out some more videos in the gimmick on screen. I'll see you all next time.